So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us here in this latest Basis Technologies webinar in our series of webinars on DevOps and test automation and all things related to those topics in the world of SAP. My name is Peter Yabsley, as you might be able to see from the video screen there. And today we're going to be talking about an SAP Team's Guide to Robotic Test Automation, a new concept in regression testing, and some reasons why SAP teams should look at this new way of working as part of their testing regime. As always, a little bit of webinar admin just before we begin. Everybody is on mute, as is pretty normal in these things. But if you do have questions, we'd encourage you to enter those in the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll try and get to a couple of those at the end of today's session, or as many as we can. We'll probably be looking to run for about 45 minutes in today's slot. As always, this is a recorded webinar, so a link to the recording will be sent to all registrants probably in a day or two. So if you want to get hold of that link, and you don't see it in your inbox in the next day or two, do please get in touch. You can do that via our website. We'll have some details as well at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, let's do some introductions of the people you can hopefully see on your screen here today. As I've said, my name is Peter Yabsley. I'm the head of product marketing here at Basis Technologies. You will no doubt have seen my face or heard my voice if you've joined one of these calls before, but I'm very pleased also to say that I'm joined by Jim Duggar, one of our technology evangelists from our office over there in Dallas in the USA. Jim, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, glad to be here.
Now, Jim has a long-standing background in the world of testing, of course, the topic that we're going to be talking about today, which is why he's here with us on the call, and he's going to be giving us some of the insight into that area as we go through. So let's take a quick look at what we are going to cover at a very high level. We're going to talk very briefly about some of the challenges around SAP testing and regression testing in particular, and then we're going to look at this alternative solution at a very high level of robotic test automation. I'm not going to get into too much detail today. What we're going to focus on in the second part of the webinar is some reasons why this new approach could be effective for your team when it comes to regression testing and how you can get going with that if you're interested. Just before we begin, before we get into the main subject, for any of you on the webinar with us here today who aren't familiar with Basis Technologies, just a brief introduction to us as a company. We make software automation that helps our customers to change the way they run and maintain and manage their SAP systems. And we do that by bringing things like DevOps, continuous delivery, and automated testing into those SAP environments through our DevOps and test automation platform, which is very importantly, and this is really the key, specifically engineered for SAP. And we're going to talk about a little bit about why that's important in today's webinar. We've been around for nearly 25 years now, very well established company with a global presence, offices all around the world, from the UK to Europe, America, of course, where Jim is today, and Australia as well. And our customer base is similarly global, so working with a lot of big organizations who are using SAP across their business. And we are purely and only an SAP shop, if you want to put it that way. Our products are only for use in SAP, they're optimized for use in SAP, that's our expertise and what we do. So it's the only area we work in. And that, of course, is why we're here today, talking about this topic of SAP regression testing. So what I want to do before we get into the webinar is start with a number. I wonder if some of you may have seen this number before. It's from an IDC report from a couple of years ago, and that number is $1 million an hour. And that's a pretty big figure, but that's the number they calculated as the potential cost of critical application failure. And I think we can all agree that at least in some, maybe many cases, SAP is really a critical business system. Especially if we're talking about things like e-commerce, we're talking supply chain, manufacturing, this is at the heart of the business. We can't afford for it to go down. And that number, it might be different in your organization. You might be thinking, well, that's way too high. You might be thinking, well, actually, it could be more. But fundamentally, what we're talking about here is this is the reason why software quality, of which obviously testing is an important element, is so important, and why we're here talking about it today. This risk and this cost is fundamentally what we're trying to avoid. And what is it that is creating that risk and that potential cost? Well, fundamentally, it's change. That's the thing most likely to cause us issues. If we've got systems that work today and we don't change anything, well, they're probably going to work tomorrow. So, well, why should we bother to change? And I think, in a way, and we'll talk about this in a bit, that's a kind of approach that has permeated SAP teams for some very good reasons. But I'd like to spin that around and say, well, what's the cost of not changing in today's business environment? What's the cost of only having those maybe twice a year or even once a year production release cycles? And if we ask ourselves that kind of question, we need to ask ourselves what it might mean if we can't change our processes and our structures to adapt to a new business environment, if we can't deliver those initiatives and that new innovation that helps us approach new markets or roll out new products. What's the risk to the business of not being able to support those new business models that our competitors are adopting that help us to differentiate in the market? What about, if we can't stay as secure and compliant as we need to be because we can't deliver upgrades and updates as often as we want to or we need to? What's the risk there? And even to the point of new technology, new functionality or new products from SAP, what's the cost if we can't capitalize on that because there's too much risk of change? So if we can find a way to increase the confidence in delivering change into our SAP systems, we're going to be able to be more agile, we're going to be able to stay more up to date, and we're going to be able to actually get more value from our investment in SAP as well. And that, of course, is where testing comes in. And it's really where I want to bring Jim into the conversation because he's the expert, in this area. And we're going to be talking specifically about a part of testing today. So Jim, I know you like to use this iceberg analogy to talk about the totality of testing in the big picture. Explain to us why that is and what we're showing on the screen here.
Yeah, what we're looking at is really the difference between ongoing everyday change that supports the business, whether it's new features and capabilities that the organization can benefit from competitively, or requirements like regulatory demand that forces change in the system. Either way, when we're making changes proactive, this is what I call progressive testing. It's the new feature, it's the new capability, it's verifying that it's working as designed. And as an industry, we tend to be very good at progressive testing. After all, it's top of mind. It's just recently been worked on by the developers, just recently been thought about by our subject matter experts that created the customer story and the requirements for it. As an industry, we're pretty good at it, and it tends to not be the issue. The issue is in an extremely large business system like SAP that has tens of thousands of different variants of business process execution. And being able to confidently answer the question, what about these changes will break the way that we do business today? That is an extraordinarily difficult question to answer simply because of the mass and scale of all the underlying functionality that exists in a system like SAP. This is not just the things that are changing. This is everything that we continue to use on a regular basis. So that's why I like this iceberg visual, because we tend to be good at the progressive stuff, and we tend to maybe go a little naked when it comes to verifying that the entirety of the underlying system still works after that set of changes.
Okay, thanks. And if we move on from that, I think what we've got on this slide is just a summary of that case for why we shouldn't be going naked, or why we should be trying not to, in terms of the value of regression testing. And this is really the flip side of that risk number that we started with, because I think it's very easy to think of regression testing, or actually any kind of testing, as just a cost center. That's something Jim and I have talked about quite a lot. The best thing that can happen is there's nothing wrong. You put a lot of effort in to do nothing about the result. And that can look quite negative, but actually what we're doing there is delivering a great deal of value. So we might be avoiding costs by just simply keeping the business running. We might be avoiding annoying our customers because they can't order that day or get what they want or get it delivered. We might be keeping our brand intact or making sure that our teams can keep working on actual value-adding work rather than firefighting and fixing the things that have broken unexpectedly. And ultimately that means we're going to be able to move faster, we're going to be able to get more done, and hopefully as a business we're going to be able to derive some commercial advantage from that. And potentially all of that has regression testing contributes at the very least to all of those elements of value. So obviously some of it might not be easy to quantify. It's not easy to put a number on this, especially maybe this will happen kind of scenario, but I think it's well worth just kind of considering this way of looking at regression testing as a value driver rather than a cost center. And of course, therefore, then the effort and investment you might put into it having that value in and of itself as well. But that said, it's a very nice aspiration. We've got this huge below the waterline we want to test, and there's loads of value in doing it. But of course, we know it's not quite as simple as all that, especially in SAP, or we wouldn't actually be here together talking today. So Jim, talk to us about some of the particular difficulties about this area in SAP.
Yeah, I mean, SAP is very special when it comes to testing for a variety of reasons. I'm going to kind of wander around the center here and give a couple of points on each one, but there's a couple that I really want to focus on specifically because they're at the real crux of the technical problem with being able to do very large scale, very high quality testing in SAP. But some of the things that I frequently face working with customers around testing SAP, I have to be able to demonstrate that my change remains compliant across the enterprise, right? This might be everything from taxing to FDA validated environments to ISO 9001. I've got reporting requirements, I've got audit requirements, and any change that I make has to meet muster in order to demonstrate that the change has not been disruptive to the legal requirements or production requirements of that organization. And so, that can be very difficult because that can be very broad reaching or be very specific and very technical. Of course, anytime we touch SAP, we run the risk of creating enterprise-wide impacts. There's a technology out there called risk-based testing I'm going to talk about in a minute, but it tries to make the assumption that if you're changing something in sales distribution, you're not impacting warehouse management or supply chain. And we all know that's bunk, right? So the thing that we have to be very careful about when we're talking about SAP is a change can be very, very far-reaching, especially if it's in something like master data. The other challenge that we face is this idea of SAP being fairly unique. It has lots of interface points, it has lots of integration points, all of which need to function correctly in a large enterprise system in order for that SAP system to be declared functional and working correctly, right? So we have to be able to get to that coverage, and we have to be able to solve for some of the architectural issues of SAP. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time later talking about that specific challenge as well. But it's these last two that just scare me when it comes to something, especially like an upgrade, right? If I do a kernel patch, or I change the underlying database, or I apply a service pack, in theory, nothing has changed in my environment. It should all function perfectly correctly after the upgrade, right? Well, what's reality? And so I have to back up from this SAP problem and ask myself, how am I literally going to test every single way that we conduct business process in this system to know that this change hasn't been disruptive? And that scale, that whole below the waterline concept in SAP is daunting, especially for larger enterprise systems. But it gets worse. And that's because SAP doesn't exist on an island. I mean, how many of us run our entire business on SAP, SAP only, and never use any other applications on the desktop other than SAP GUI? I mean, it's a completely ridiculous postulate, right? That no business runs that way today. So in order to be able to test SAP, I also have to have a test environment that's got all of its dependencies, all the things that call into SAP and create orders or interact with SAP as a system of process or system of record, and all the downstream systems, maybe a supply chain manager or warehouse management if I'm not using SAP core modules for that. So all of this has to be ready at the moment I want to be able to make a change in SAP and verify if it's going to mess up the business or not going forward, right? Very tall order, very difficult technical challenges to solve for. And this is why testing SAP robustly is so hard.
Okay, so I think points well made, and we've mentioned about sometimes the struggle that firms have to address regression testing for a variety of different reasons, maybe going a bit more naked than they'd like, but they are addressing it in some ways today. So why don't we just carry on doing that? What's the issue with the more traditional way of doing things?
Well, you're right. I mean, most people are doing testing of some capacity in SAP. But let's put a number on it. When I was doing regular testing practice around automation, if we could get a customer to something that's called a coverage percentage, that is, how many business processes flows do you have tests for? If we could get them into the neighborhood of around 30%, we considered that customer a smashing success with automation. So that is a whole lot of uncovered ground in any SAP system, right? And I'm going to talk through the problem that we have with these methodologies that we've been using today, because they leave us fairly naked, even if we make substantial investments into the testing methodology itself. So if we think about manual testing, right? I mean, manual testing, we call it an O of N function. Work in is work out. If I want to run a test, I've really got two things I can do, two levers I can control in order to get more coverage in a manual testing environment. I can use more people, which allows me to execute more testing, or I can take more calendar time, which gives that same person more time to do more test executions and achieve more coverage. And those are kind of the two knobs you have with manual testing. It's low coverage, it's expensive, it's literally manual work. One of the things that I've always talked to customers about is, so let me get this straight, we have an entire lab full of people fully trained to be able to execute business process in our system, and we're doing them for testing? Why don't we let them do real work, right? I mean, there's all this opportunity cost that's involved with having people so highly trained and capable of doing real outcome-based work, and they're in the testing lab, right? And I don't mean to take anything away from testing, its importance, but it is a question that I think we should ask as business people. If we look at automation, the whole promise of automation was to accelerate the execution of the tests themselves. Therefore, you'd be able to get a lot more of them run in a much shorter, compressed amount of time. That is absolutely a factual outcome with automation, but it has a drawback. It takes a fairly sophisticated person to create and maintain it. So at some point with automation, you're going to get to this point in the curve where you have enough tests that require maintenance. They're what we call broken. They won't play back correctly anymore. And so you have enough tests that are broken, they're missing data, that particular workflow no longer exists in the test system, whatever. And now just keeping those up to date is consuming your resources that would normally create new tests. So you find this upper bound, 30, 35% of coverage that's possible with traditional automation. And in fact, if you don't continue to throw that level of effort into it, and not only does it not level off, it will actually decline because more tests will continue to break over time. Definitely, it's been a big challenge in SAP to get this existing approach and tooling to give us really high amounts of coverage and really solve the problem of regression testing.
Okay, so to sort of summarize that, what we're kind of basically saying with traditional test methods, whichever we choose, is we're probably not going to have enough money. If we do have enough money, we might not have enough people. Even if we can get both of those, we might not have enough time. And even if we've got all the testing resources we need, well, we're still reliant on the goodwill of those functional people and the time of those functional people who have the expertise to come and support us in that testing. And that can be a real challenge, doing it on a regular basis. And then there's also this question of technical access, which we haven't really delved into yet, but involves looking at how much of the system we can actually see into and test beyond the UI as well. And with those traditional methods, especially if you're doing it manually, you're going to be limited to what that person can actually interact with. So let's say some quite severe sometimes limitations of the traditional approach to regression testing, and that brings us to this alternative approach of robotic test automation. So Jim, as I've said, we're not going to dive into too much technical detail in today's session, but just explain to us the concept of a robotic test automation for SAP.
Yeah, so robotic test automation, I might use the acronym RTA in this discussion as well. This was an innovation in regression testing, specifically around ERP systems around like SAP, that helps solve for this volume and scale problem that we have with traditional testing tools. So we talked a lot about the fact that you're having to create and maintain a library, or you're having to run manual tests. The thing about RTA is it solves what I'll call both halves of the testing problem. Not only does it have the ability to execute the tests, but perhaps even more importantly, it has the ability to understand what the test should be and automatically author them. So if you've ever spent any time writing test scripts, either for automated purposes or for manual testing, you know what a burden and what a heavy lift that is to go understand all the different ways business processes might be executed in an underlying system like SAP and create coverage for each of those, whether or not your team could even execute it. So the idea with robotic test automation is let's use an instrumentation technology, not only like what we see in systems like C# or Java where you have bytecode instrumentation, but let's use an instrumentation technology to understand how the organization depends on SAP and do that in a production environment. This allows you to be able to see everything that happens in the ABAP stack, whether it be a batch job, a SAP GUI login, web services calls, RFCs, anything, right? The idea is to have a very good understanding of exactly how that system is used. And unlike any other platform, with an ERP system like SAP, we can take what's called a system copy of that production environment as well. And this is used all the time for people that are doing things like refreshing QA from production to have test data and these sorts of things. What we're going to do is take that system copy along with that recording and go create a private test environment that we can use for evaluating any change. So then the whole RTA approach depends on you simply applying any transports or updates, upgrades, whatever you want to test to that test environment, and using a time machine technique to set back the clock, school that system into thinking that it's actually in that place still, and re-executing all of those tests that were observed, all that real activity that was observed during the course of the recording period. So really neat approach to solve test data problems, test creation problems, and eliminate the need to create and maintain that test library, which has traditionally been a barrier to success, especially with large-scale regression testing.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So that's a high-level summary of what robotic test automation is and the what in this conversation. But let's have a look at the why, and let's have a look at those 5 reasons. And of course, not the only 5, but 5 of the key reasons why SAP teams may want to consider adopting robotic test automation for their regression testing. And first of all, and you've covered this at some level already, Jim, but this is kind of the big one, perhaps the most obvious thing with RTA. What's the impact of being able to get rid of those test scripts from the regression test process?
Well, there's a whole litany of them, but the obvious one is the labor involved with the creation and maintenance of test scripts. That is no small lift. It requires very smart people that understand the system very well to do, and it's just a large amount of labor. Now, there's some smaller benefits that can have very peculiar circumstances as well. One of those is the fact that the way that end users are supposed to use the system may not be the way that they're actually performing business tasks. We see this all the time, and our clever business users are very good at finding more efficient and more effective ways to use our underlying IT systems, and good on them, right? Everybody benefits, except when it comes time to testing, and we don't have a test case for the way that they use that system, right? So not having to do that, not even having to understand what your business processes are, letting the robotics do that for you. This is a very substantial advantage in terms of the type of testing that you get to do.
And I guess there's potentially a benefit here in those cases where it's not obvious what the test should be, or maybe you don't have the resources to build a new test, let's say for a particular project. Well, I'm thinking perhaps of your comment again around upgrades and the, let's say, lack of visibility that can happen there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with upgrades, it's always been difficult to test them thoroughly because all of your effort is a one-off. Whereas if you're using robotic test automation, you could throw the entire test harness and test library away every single time, and the incremental labor to go get a new one is nominal because the system is doing that for you, right? So it really changes the way you might think about how you approach regression testing and using comprehensive testing in situations where before it just wasn't so practical.
Well, that actually brings us very nicely on to point number 2 in our list of 5. So what we're saying here, first of all, is we're cutting out a huge amount of that effort from this regression testing process, and we're giving the team back that time to do real work, to do the more interesting stuff that adds more value. But point number 2 is that we can also stop worrying about what to test and get away from this idea of compromise in the regression test process. Why is that so important, and how does that link back to what you were talking about just now?
Well, we had the one example of the business doing things that wasn't the prescribed way of performing process. And one of the phrases that I've always used when consulting around testing is, it's never the happy path that takes down production. It's always that thing on the edge that we didn't realize was so important to the organization, but wasn't ever thought of as a principal business process or as a primary constrictor to the system functioning correctly. So with RTA, again, not only are we not creating the scripts and not paying for the labor associated with them, we don't even have to know what business processes are in our organization. It's going to do that for us through observation. And in fact, the tests that it creates are going to be exactly how the users depend on the system, not what we think they should be doing. I think we can have a conversation about for progressive testing where that might not be ideal. And I'd be open to that idea because after all, we've just designed new capabilities in the system, and end users need to learn how to use those things properly to get the full value that's intended from the engineering we put into them. But from a regression standpoint, I will completely disagree, because of course, evolution and how we use and depend on a business system does change over time. And it's probably not in line perfectly with the original documentation from years ago when we first created the feature or the capability, right? So this is a very, very important concept in regression testing.
So we're going to reduce the effort, and we're going to increase our coverage, get away from that idea of risk ranking and whether we have the full picture and the compromise we might need to make in terms of what's achievable versus what we can do. So we're going to be able to hopefully up our confidence in what we're actually delivering as a team when we do that production deployment. Point 3 I want to move on to here is about scale. Despite what I've said about frequency of change, SAP landscapes very much don't stand still like a lot of other enterprise systems. And that could be because of business change as much as software change. And it could mean scaling down as well as scaling up. So, how does robotic test automation help us to scale that regression testing as our SAP landscape evolves?
Yeah, so this is again where the robotics and the fact that we're not having to do labor that directly correlates with the variances, size, and scale of business process in those systems pays a huge dividend, right? So it will come to no surprise to anybody that as you add modules, as you add systems, as you add capability, you have more to test. And so unless you're also adding significant resources to your testing team or your testing automation team, the amount of coverage that you're going to get, the amount of safety and insurance that testing brings you after each change is going to continue to decline, simply because it's got a fairly static amount of work that it can get done, and you have more to do, right? This is not a big surprise. Likewise, as the system gets older, the same problem occurs because you have more capabilities that have been accumulating, the tip of the iceberg, right, over that period of time. Now, industry has introduced a couple of different technologies to help pacify this problem to a degree, primarily one that's known as risk-based testing. And so the idea with risk-based testing is I go do an analysis of technically what's changed, and in theory, I get a smaller test set of what I need to actually go run tests again, maybe something that is consumable by my test team that hasn't scaled as much as the platform has grown. Again, I'm going to say that the happy path is never what brings down production, especially when we start touching things. I think we have a whole webinar on this topic as well, too, where we talk about all the technical challenges of doing RT or doing risk-based testing correctly and why it tends to fail. But all of those problems go away with RTA because with RTA, literally getting a vision of exactly how your organization depends on SAP is as simple as running another instrumentation recording. And so these problems are just very much different in the RTA world than they are using any kind of traditional test approach.
And so when our business processes change, or our business organization changes, or our, we buy a new business, we've got to merge with a business, we divest a business unit, all of that's going to impact our business processes, all of that's going to impact our typical test scripts. And that issue of scaling up and down, as you said, just goes away then with RTA. And I guess that's also a good point, just to elaborate a little bit more, maybe in terms of effort or impact on that question of test data, because obviously changes in the business and business processes are going to have a similar impact on the need for test data and what data you need. How is specifically RTA helping resolve that test data challenge?
Well, I mean, in short, it just makes it go away. But to understand that comment, you have to understand the approach of RTA. So remember, we're instrumenting production, recording all the real traffic that happens there, and coupling that recording with a copy of the ERP system itself that we'll use for test execution. So in that environment, all of those transactions that were recorded haven't happened yet. And we're able to perform them again and use them as the test harness, because we know they were successful, they were recorded in production after all, but they haven't happened yet in our test bed, and that allows us to be able to do this. As a curious side project, I'll encourage the listeners today to go price a test data management solution versus the price of a test automation solution. And you know what? The TDM solutions are more expensive because it's a bigger problem to solve, right? It's a harder problem to solve as well. So I love this RTA approach just because it makes that whole class of issue go away.
So for the SAP team, and particularly the QA team, we're getting rid of a bunch of that effort. We're increasing confidence and coverage. We covered that, but we're also keeping our testing current and scaling with the business much more easily, and getting rid of that concern about test data as a problem. Let's look at number 4, which I think is also an interesting one. We've got DevOps in the title here, but what we're really talking about is the idea of shift left, I guess. So how does RTA open up some opportunities here?
Yeah, this is a really important concept, especially for testing in SAP. So in most of my career, I had to wait till essentially what was UAT, user acceptance testing, before I could do the very first bit of regression testing. And the reason why is simple. We talked about this earlier in the webinar. We talked about SAP not existing on an island, but instead being very much part of an integrated set of applications that runs the business in total. So, I've lost count of the number of businesses that use Salesforce for CRM, that use SAP for GL, and who knows what else, and then have Manhattan for warehouse management, right? I mean, that is such a common situation to have a multiple different set of these enterprise applications that all work together in one way or another. Well, if I have a business process inside of SAP that has dependencies on this system, maybe the sale originates in Salesforce, or an inventory query, it goes into Manhattan, I have to wait until I have a QA environment that's completely assembled and has all of these pieces in it, that's also all been populated with data, in order for me to do my very first regression test, because after all, that test might have a dependency downstream. So this causes very late testing. It causes very expensive testing. For someone that wants to do a little bit of background on this, I mean, this story is ancient in terms of computing. We first learned about this problem in the waterfall days of OS 360, the IBM mainframe operating system. There's a great book out there called The Mythical Man-Month that goes into this. But what we can do today that's different, and really where the word DevOps comes in, is this idea of service virtualization. So service virtualization automatically understands the upstream and downstream dependencies a system under test might have, and it resolves those in a way that's good enough for the purpose of testing. A good RTA solution should have service virtualization as part of its capabilities, and it's using that instrumentation at record time to be able to create that necessary virtualization to isolate this problem. So what this allows us to do, I could literally go to a developer and do a transport of copies before the code even goes to QA and begin doing regression testing. So what might that be worth to be able to go ahead and get all of your SAP early regression testing done before you ever push the transports into QA, right? And that's the big story here, where remediation is easier, where the cost of defects is much lower, where we found them much sooner in the cycle. Very important part of what's happening with RTA.
Okay, great. So we're talking, reasons for RTA. We've talked effort, we've talked confidence, we've talked scale, we've talked speed and timeliness and cost again here on this screen. So let's just wrap that up with number 5 by coming back to where I started at the beginning, almost at the beginning of today's presentation, because with more comprehensive, more effective regression testing, which RTA as a technology has the ability to give us, we can support those kind of transformation initiatives, and maybe transformation is too big a word here, but those kind of change initiatives and projects that are going to add value to the business. We're going to be able to roll more of them out more quickly, with more confidence. We're going to be able to do upgrades and updates more regularly, perhaps, than in the past, because we have a better view of the impact that's going to happen. So we're going to have the ability to make sure that the fear of unintended consequences is holding back the business less than would otherwise be the case with those more traditional testing methods. So all that said, that's I think 5 pretty solid reasons why RTA is certainly worthy of at least consideration. But Jim, if somebody wants to go beyond that, how can they get started with it today?
Yep. So our implementation of RTA is in a product called Testimony, which is a portion of our DevOps suite, which includes both Testimony and the Active Control solution. The nice thing about Testimony, like I talked about earlier, is it solves for both halves of this testing problem. It can automatically understand what to test and how to test it. It will automatically create a test harness. And then, of course, it has the ability to execute that test harness and test set as a very robust, very full regression test that would be very difficult to use using other technologies. And if we look at the timeline of using Testimony, I think we get to see one of the biggest benefits of how the technology applies itself in the real world. When I was doing testing consulting using traditional methodologies, I would, of course, arrive at a customer, big smile on my face, Monday morning. Hi, my name is Jim. I'm really happy to be here, and let's diagram all of your business processes. We'd spend weeks drawing lines between sticky notes on the whiteboard, right? But all of that kind of upfront work just goes away in an RTA environment. We simply do not need to know how the system is used today, because the system will figure it out for us. And so the results and the basic bargain with an RTA approach is that your very first test cycle is shorter, simply because you're not doing the upfront work. And your subsequent test cycles are lower labor because you're not having to maintain the test scripts. You're not having to do that kind of work that's traditionally associated with automation tools. So especially if you're starting to look at incremental deliveries, much more frequent deliveries to production, we work with customers all the time going from twice a year to once a day even. All of a sudden, this technology becomes a viable approach to be able to still deliver a very high level of regression testing, but do so in a much shortened window of time that would have been impractical using previous kinds of tooling.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Well, let's just start to wrap things up. Then we're nearly at the end of today's slot. We've talked about those kind of 5 broad reasons why RTA can provide value to an SAP team, but let's just wrap up looking specifically at how it might help some different team members. I'm sure we've got a mix of people on the call here today. Take us around the circle.
Yeah, it's really strong for our developers, functional users, and QA. But I'm going to start with basis. It probably makes the smallest difference here, but it does get our basis team out of the business of having to constantly do things like system refreshes from production and scrub data and build test environments and do this kind of thing, just simply because we're going to be using the SAP environment and the transport path in an extremely different way when we've got RTA in place. But for our developers, it starts paying very large dividends. Imagine being able to do fully robust regression testing in a true SAP environment, but long before the UAT assembly or the integrated assembly in QA existed, and be able to get all of your remediation done before you even promote the transports into QA. For our functional users, imagine not having to perform manually all of those different tests and having to provide all the consulting and business knowledge around what the test should be and documenting test scripts and working with your organization, and maybe even having to go cull the system and figure out what kind of test data is necessary to support a test harness like that. Imagine all of that work kind of going away. And of course, for our QA team, this is where I think one of the biggest impacts is made. Instead of working on retesting things that have, at least in the past, always worked, what if you could spend your time making sure that new functional capability is truly robust and ready for the business? What if we could free up your time from doing the less value-add activity of regression testing to the more value-add activity of being able to get new capabilities and new features for the business into production faster? So, I mean, it's a classic TCQ story here, but do less work, get more done. That's a neat part of robotics, right?
Okay, so let's just, again, wrap that up and bring ourselves back to kind of where we started at the beginning. In the, robotic test automation, I think we've been through a number of different ways in which it can deliver really significant value for the reasons we've talked about today and more. It's got the potential there to help you accelerate transformation and accelerate delivery of projects and initiatives, to reduce that, and thereby, of course, reduce that time to value, get stuff out there more quickly and get value from it in the business. It's going to give you more coverage and confidence to reduce those issues that you might unfortunately come across otherwise. And of course, there's a cost impact in terms of helping you to reduce that overall cost, perhaps by saving that $1 million that we started today's presentation with, and ultimately in being able to keep our systems more current, keep them updated more often, get those projects out. We're going to extract more value from our investment in SAP. Effective regression testing is going to help you to contribute to all of those things. So in summary today, we've looked at how there are a number of factors driving the need for better, more comprehensive software testing, because we've got to keep changing our systems today. We can't sit back and say it's too risky. But those traditional approaches to testing have their drawbacks and are typically too time consuming, too error prone to be really confident in that approach, despite the fact that the cost of not getting it right can be so high. And we've looked at how robotic test automation can provide a more effective alternative for that SAP regression testing piece to reduce the effort and minimize the business risk when you make changes to your systems. So that's the end of our slides. As I say, we'll go to some questions in just a second. We'll take a look, but just before we do that, just want to thank everybody who's joined us today. Jim, also thank you for your contribution, taking us through that information. For any of our attendees, if you'd like to discuss this in more detail, you'd like more information, do please feel free to get in touch using those contact details that are on the screen there, either via our website or to Jim directly. And as I've mentioned, this is a recorded session. We will be sending out a link. You should get that in the next day or two. So if you don't see that for any reason and you want to get a hold of it, do please get in touch with us so we can make sure to send that out to you. So before we wrap up today's session, let's take a quick look at any questions that may have come in. Let's see, should be maybe quite a simple one to start with, Jim. Just to clarify, for RTA, do we need a dedicated RTA test environment effectively?
You don't need a dedicated landscape, but you do need a dedicated system that will be the test target. And this is different from your typical QA that's part of your transport path. The reason for this is it's going to be operating at full production scale, and it's going to be doing a full production workload. Obviously, one of the things that RTA is going to do is simply do more testing, and therefore the underlying environment does require more capacity. We strongly recommend, hyperscaler for this. This allows you to do all kinds of neat things, but scale up, scale down, only pay for the time that you're using. But most importantly, also take advantage of virtualization features, which allow you to reset the image and use it over and over and things like that. So if those kinds of topics are an area of interest, hey, the contact information is there. Would love to have the dialogue with you and follow up on that question some more. So it's an important part of what we're doing here.
I think the next one, one that comes up fairly commonly actually, is around the content of recording. And what if a critical period, like let's say a month end, I'm paraphrasing slightly here, but a critical period isn't in that recording? How do you deal with that?
Well, the easy way to do it is multiple recordings. And that is fairly common because businesses tend to be periodic. I mean, it's great when we can come into a shop that's got a constant stream of in-flight, long-running business process that spans every month and every quarter, and that's how the entire business runs. Hey, that's awesome. One recording knocks it out, right? But it's extremely typical that we have things like sales and deliveries front-loaded in a month, and then things like reconciliation and billing and collecting backloaded in the quarter. So the best way to solve for that is just simply multiple recordings of those different time periods.
Okay. There's a follow-up here, I guess, to the first question, which you've already, I think, started to cover there. But one of our attendees is just asking if the tool will take care of creating that environment in which the RTA playback is run to do the test, or if that needs to be created separately before you run the tool.
A portion of it does automatically, but the actual basis work of, say, copying the database and giving us an SAP instance with a number of app servers, that portion we don't do automatically. And that, again, is where the hyperscaler can be very effective. Or if you're in a virtualized environment, ESX server, these kinds of things, that can make that part of the job very easy.
Okay, thanks. Just a couple more here to go through, just while we get to the end of our slot. Question about coverage, because you were talking about coverage earlier. Actually, what kind of coverage can you typically get with RTA or with testimony?
It varies quite a bit, but it's almost always north of 50 or 60%, and sometimes considerably higher. One of the things that we do when we work with a customer on an implementation is we actually get workflow statistics and do other analysis of their production environment to understand when the cherry recording moment would be. And with that information, we're actually able to pick a recording window that is shorter, which helps the test run a shorter duration, but also provides just as much coverage as, say, maybe another time period. So this is something that we would work with you on to understand. But again, being well north of any other testing methodology out there, easily into the 60s. I mean, this is the much more commonplace outcome with RTA approach versus something like traditional testing.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to give you an easy one to finish with, because I think this one came in a bit before we covered it during the session. But would you recommend using testimony to regression test an SAP upgrade?
That's the best place to use it, right? I have this phrase that I like to say. It's in theory nothing's changing, but in reality we've just replaced our kernel, our underlying data, all the underlying system. Who knows what we've affected, right? With something like an upgrade, if you do a risk-based analysis on that, it's going to come back and tell you to run everything you got. Creating an entirely new test harness just to do this one-off activity is extremely inefficient. This is a place that RTA just absolutely excels at. It's 100% regression testing. There's no new functionality being introduced. I can't think of a better approach for an upgrade. And especially as we get into S4, right, where we're doing those probably annually even with the SAP release pace, this is a great approach for solving that problem.
Yeah, and I think we've covered today, that's clearly far from the only place that RTA can help, but it's certainly a good use case for the technology there, absolutely. Okay, well, that is the end of today's session. So once again, just remains for me to say thank you very much to everybody who joined us, and do please look out for the next Basis Technologies webinar, either on the website or in your emails, and we hope to see you at another session soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.